I believe most of you are familiar on these images of Kuthumi and Moria, who have semi-canonical status among theosophists. But in 1911, Annie Besant said she was not persuaded by the portrait of Kuthumi because Kuthumi was too dark, while the real Kuthumi is fair-skinned Kashmiri Brahmana. Now, we don't know. There is a dissertation never published as a book done 17 years ago by Dr. Brendan French in Australia about the masters, and it's unclear what Besant was really talking about. Was she talking about the original portrait by Herman Schmicken, or was she talking of the copy made by an Australian artist you see here, Florence Farr? But before we go into this, I would like to introduce the genre of master painting, which has some relation, but it's not the same as spirit painting. Now, when Blavatsky started, so to speak, her career as an esotericist, spirits of the dead were very busy in doing two different things. One was guiding the hands of mediums in doing portraits and other art, and the second thing was really precipitating painting. They appeared out of nowhere or on a white canvas, and so they were more miraculous than the first kind of art. For instance, the Campbell brothers were very famous in American spiritualism. That's a precipitated portrait of Lincoln you can see in the still active spiritualist camp in Lilydale, New York. Now, the difference between the spirits of the dead of the masters is obviously the masters were not dead, but once you account for this admittedly very important difference, to have the hands guided telepathically by the masters from Tibet, or to have the masters precipitating in your room a painting miraculously, it's not so different from having the spirits of the dead guiding the hands of a painter or precipitating paintings. Now, before she started dealing with master painting, HBB herself was into spirit paintings. John Patrick Devaney wrote what I believe to be the definitive study of Blavatsky as a spirit painter in 2001, and he mentions dozens of paintings precipitated in Blavatsky's presence by the spirit. This one is John King, and John King was quite famous in spiritualism, but later Blavatsky claimed John King was one and the same as Master Hilarion. So you see spirit painting going into master's painting. In 1876, a French artist called Monsieur Harris, and I and Patrick Devaney, it's 20 years, we are trying to chase him down, but we know precious nothing about Monsieur Harris, visited Blavatsky and Olcott in New York and produced this portrait of Master Moria. And Olcott, in all dire reliefs, says it was a real case of truth transference because we had Blavatsky sitting in front of a wrist and transmitting the image of the master. And there were some miraculous confirmation. Number one, Master Moria signed the painting. And Harris didn't write Master Moria did. And number two, interestingly, Olcott said that he gave money to a shopkeeper for paper and crayons, but when he returned home, he found the money back in the envelope, and the shopkeeper denied to have given the money back, so it was the master giving to him the money back. So the Harris portrait was already a miraculous one, but was telepathically produced. It was not precipitation. However, there were precipitated master's paintings in Theosophical Society. Alcott mentions one of Serapis Bey, for instance. And in 1882 in India, Blavatsky tried to sketch a portrait of Kut-Umi, but the result was not very good. So Kut-Umi precipitated a portrait on himself of better quality. And in the same years, 1882, Master Maurya gave to a theosophist from Tamil called Ramaswamy a portrait of himself. This portrait was published in a book in 1894 by the son of Ramaswamy, who was actually an enemy of the Theosophical Society, who wanted to make fun of his father by publishing this portrait. In 1884 in London, Colonel Alcott decided he wanted a better portrait from the Harris one. So he took, he said, 3 professionals and 2 amateurs. We know one of the professionals was Isabel Steiger, and told them, here is the portrait by Harris, try to make a better one. And one of these is mentioned in Alcott will as loan to Besant and to be returned to Ajar headquarters after her death. We don't know what happened to it. Of course, perhaps somebody in Ajar will know. But none of these portraits was very good, according to Alcott. So things changed in 1884 when Theosophical Society was joined by Hermann Schmicken. Hermann Schmicken had been personally invited to London by Queen Victoria as a famous portrait painter, and he was undoubtedly very skilled. And so he became a member of Theosophical Society and was asked by Blavatsky to produce portraits of Kut-Umi and Maurya. Actually, the order came directly by Master Maurya. It's in a letter you can still see at the Winterthur Library in Delaware, and that's Maurya writing to Blavatsky, say to S, that means Schmicken, that he will be helped. I myself will guide his hands with brush for key, that's Kut-Umi's portrait. So the order to have Schmicken produce the portraits came straight from the masters. How the portraits were produced is very interesting. We call sort of spiritual telegraph, because Blavatsky decided they needed Laura Holloway, and she didn't like Laura Holloway because she was a flirt, but she believed Laura Holloway to be a very strong medium, perhaps stronger than Blavatsky herself, at least for some purposes. So what happened was we have Blavatsky in Schmicken's studio, and she's under the tent. She cannot see anything. But she receives from the masters their images and sends them telepathically to Laura Holloway. And Laura Holloway works as an amplifier and amplifies the images so that Schmicken, who's no clairvoyant, can pick the amplified image up and paint the portraits. But Blavatsky, who cannot see, she's hidden by the tent, she will correct without seeing, saying, you are making a mistake, go back. So it's completely miraculous portrait, and that's the result. But we don't know. There is a lot of confusion. Helmut Zander tried to sort out the confusion before me, because Schmeichen produced miraculously the first two portraits. But when he did copies, not miraculously, he copied himself, he did surely a set for the Gebhards in Germany, he did a set for Judge, and most probably did a set for Rudolf Steiner, who very lately were still used secretly for anthroposophical ceremonies. Now, these were the first portraits, but there were others. In 1897, Isabel Varley traveled astrally from London to Tibet and came back with two miniature portraits phenomenally transported to London. And Leadbeater donated them, one to Basil Hodgson Smith, they were quite young at the time, and one to the future President Jean Rajadaza. Apparently, Besant declared the miniatures by Varley better than the canonical Schmicken's portrait because the skin of the masters was more white. And these two miniatures may still exist in a jar, but no scholar has seen them, and they have never been reproduced in print. Ross, in an article in 1999, claimed that Rukmini Devi Arundale also had miniatures of Kutumi and Moria, once belonging to Olcott, but it's unclear if they were the same miniatures or not. And she also had the miniature of Master Jesus that Jesus gave personally to Besant. But now another important chapter in the Besant era is the intervention of a recognized painter, Florence Fuller, who was sort of a child prodigy of Australian art. At age 17, he painted this portrait of Chief Barak, Aboriginal politician, and she became a sensation, and some of her paintings are real part of the national paintings of Australia. But at one stage, in 1905, she was already famous. Fuller meets Leadbeater and decides to basically leave her activity as working for galleries and work only for the Theosophical Society. So she produced portraits of Blavatsky, of course based on photographs. She was dead at the time, and of Leadbeater. And she started working, she went to a jar, and she started working at the portraits of the master. So that's a new Besant era set. We don't know a lot about them because they are kept under lock and key in a jar, except that one was published, one was given to the Australian Theosophical Society, that's the Master Buddha, and that one was published. It's very probable that also this portrait, here reproduced in black and white, and Gregory Tillett reproduced it in black and white. I had long correspondence with Tillett. He was not exactly authorized to go to a jar and took some pictures, but he did. And the World Mother is a sort of a new member of the occult hierarchy discovered by Leadbeater in 1928. Now, the World Mother here is actually Ruth Elizabeth Roberts, who was the wife of liberal Catholic Bishop Tetmer. So it's the World Mother, but it's a portrait of a known theosophist. Now, Fuller's story is a tragic story because, well, we can have two interpretations. Number one, it was too much for her to be mystical in the presence of the master, so she has a nervous breakdown. But number two, she was also widely criticized as an associate of Leadbeater because of Leadbeater's personal problems. So from being the darling of the artistic establishment in Australia, she ended up in a psychiatric hospital where she spent the last 20 years of her life, and she was rediscovered only recently as a great Australian artist. Now, Fuller, in a jar, became friendly with a lesser artist, the Italian Maria Luisa Kirby, who was the wife of theosophical businessman William Kirby, and she painted portraits of the masters. So she learned to see on the astral plane. She also worked a lot on the previous incarnation of Krishnamurti under the guidance of Leadbeater. And that's the Lord Maitreya by Maria Luisa Kirby. Another of this group of women artists working with Leadbeater in Besant years was Theodora St. John. Now, this portrait of the Lord Maitreya became a very sacred portrait in the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society first, but later in the Liberal Catholic Church. And interestingly, we have some picture, and Kirby wanted to paint the Lord Maitreya, but at one stage in the literature of the Liberal Catholic Church, it became the Christ. Not Jesus Christ, the Christ, of course, but yet. And it was also used in rituals of the Order of the Round Table. Now, these paintings are not precipitated. They don't come from the sky. They don't appear on a white canvas. It's masters showing themselves or guiding the hands of the artist. But precipitated paintings didn't disappear entirely. In 1925, a book by Leadbeater was published called The Masters and the Path, and this painting was on the cover and was described as precipitated by Master Dewal-Cool on silk. It was signed by Guy Benjamin, but Guy Benjamin was really a pseudonym according to the Leadbeater of Dewal-Cool. It was said the original is in a jar, and perhaps it's too small to see, but there are small images of Master Moria riding a horse and Dewal-Cool in the river. And Leadbeater claimed for Dewal-Cool that he shows only his back, because he believes that his Mongolian features are not worth putting on the record. So Dewal-Cool was aware he was a little bit ugly, so he preferred not to be reproduced in front. Now, in conclusion, we have the last set of portraits of the masters, which were produced by British artist David Henrias, pseudonym of Brian Henrias Ross, and publishing Through the Eyes of the Masters in 1932, and they really conclude the Besant era of masters painting. Now, of course, I have here Kurt Leland, and images on the next slides he graciously shared with me. He's an expert on Cyril Scott, and Henrias was sort of best friend of Cyril Scott. They worked together. Scott was a composer, and you will all read his history, I believe, in Kurt's forthcoming book. but I only read the doctoral dissertation on him. Small, this may or may not be very accurate, but it tells the extraordinary story of how at one stage he married the theosophist and novelist Rose Allatini. What was the extraordinary feature of this marriage? That at that time Scott was gay and Allatini was lesbian. But they were both told by Kut Umi they should marry, and so what could they do? They followed the instructions of the masters and produced 2 children, although they eventually separated. Well, whether this story is completely true or not, we will probably discover in a course book, but it's widely told, and as we say in Italian, if it's not true, it's very well invented. Now, these images, as I said, came from the courtesy of Kurt here, and these are not part of the set of portraits of the masters produced by Ross, but they illustrate books by Scott. That's Kut Umi playing the piano. And that's the 2 portraits of the Master Jesus by Ross for another book by Scott. But that's the most well-known series of portraits of the Masters by Ross. You have that upstairs. I don't know if it's the original or if it's a copy. Leslie can probably tell me. They are upstairs in this building. And the explanation Ross and Scott gave why the portraits appeared, it's because of the Krishnamurti incident. So say, since people started doubting in the existence of the masters allowed new portraits to be produced. But here is the opinion of Gina Rajadasa about the Ross portraits. He says, well, Mr. Ross is psychic, but he has also seen, he is also a member of the esoteric section. He has seen the portraits in a jar, so who knows whether they were produced miraculously or they were produced because he had seen portraits in a jar. So he, Gina Rajadasa, said in a letter to the esoteric section of the American Theosophical Society in 1947 that they may or may not be exact likeness of the masters. So you're free to believe, you're free not to believe. They are, so to speak, not official. I will conclude with 2 postscripts. Of course, there is other stuff, but that's after Besant. And I will conclude with 2 postscripts. Number 1, Nicholas Roerich. Here is a great painter. His paintings now are sold for millions. Roerich was a theosophist, although he later, with his wife, established a sort of schismatic group, the Agni Yoga. Roerich, of course, painted the masters. First set of painting of the masters by Roerich are hidden, because he painted Saint Sergius of Radonesh, famous Russian saint. But if you read the journals, which has been recently published, of Roerich's secretary, you will see that for him, Saint Sergius and Master Moria were one and the same. So by painting Saint Sergius, he was really painting Master Moria. But perhaps less beautifully, but more importantly, he painting a sketch of Allal Ming, and for him, Allal Ming was again Master Moria. And Allal Ming, he claimed he didn't see in the astral plane, he see from a little bit far away in Hyde Park in London. He was walking and he had the revelation it was really Master Moria walking in Hyde Park, so he went home and sketched this portrait, which is still existing in Moscow. Second, Daniel Gauguin already told the story of the Kumaras. That's the painting which was actually sold in 2014 in Lokeren in an auction, and last week the preliminary drawings, which may be more beautiful than the painting, was offered for sale for a lot of money. So I doubt they have really sold it in another auction. And these are 4 Kumaras. If you look, there are 4, they are not 3. So they are the 4 exoteric Kumaras, not to be confused with the 3 esoteric Kumaras. The Kumaras have a long story in theosophy, and Besant also mentioned them, but as far as I know, nobody represented them among so many theosophical painters. So that's the uniqueness of Delville's painting. And it's our fault because they were in previous catalogs of Delville's work, they even called Comeras, they didn't know what the heck they were. And the painting changed hands for very small money, but unfortunately, because Daniel Gauguin and the undersigned explained it's a very important theosophical painting, the price went up, and perhaps, I don't know about Daniel, but I was too poor to buy it at the resale. And it's all our fault, because when nobody knew what it is, it's some strange decorative, but when we started writing, it's very important for theosophical history, the galleries and auction houses took notice and obviously raised the price. And here again you have already seen it's Jean Delville with Besant. So here I have put these 2 postscripts of Roerich and Delville to see that in a way, Master's painting was also something some great painters did, but Schmicken was not a bad painter. Today is regarded as very academic and conventional, but both Roerich and Delville are, of course, highly praised painters today. And that's me in Moscow with the Al-Alming Roerich portrait. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. I have just a question. So you talked about Maria Louisa Kirby, and you mentioned that she was doing the portraits of Krishnamurti and past lives. These are the ones that are published in the Lives of Alcyone, is that so?
I believe so, and she was also teaching Krishnamurti how to paint. That's in the Leuten's biography, I believe. She was teaching Krishnamurti how. She was not a great painter, she was just a very rich Italian lady and amateur painter, but she in turn was learning a lot by Fuller, and Fuller was an exceptionally good painter.
I just came into possession of the Lives of Alcyone. I was remarking on the many colored portraits that are spread through it.
I don't remember. Somebody perhaps here knows if they are all by Kirby. I don't know. I should check it out. I should check it out.
From the audience here? I have actually another point. I've recently become interested in a theosophical German painter, Melchior Lechter. He was a close friend of Cyril Scott. And he seems to have done some portraits involving the spiritual hierarchy. I'm not sure if they're as specific as Kumara's, but I recently got a catalog raisonné of his work, and if I find... Yeah,
Lecter is one which needs to be studied, and the problem in doing a book on which I plan to do on artist and theosophy is there are several hundreds of them. Last year, for instance, I talked about Fidus, was one stage in this room, in this conference. Fidus was actually a Nazi painter, but before being a Nazi was theosophist. And so many painters had something to do with theosophy that it will take a long time to try to catalog and cover all of them. For other religious movements it's easier because maybe 20, 30. In Theosophical Society really there were hundreds of painters, but that's a sociological question and historiographical question in itself. Why were so many painters attractive to the Theosophical Society, which was never a huge organization? For instance, Mormons, which are now 16 million, they spent a lot of money in what they call artistic missions, to send the young people to Paris, not to be missionaries, but to learn painting in the Académie Julia and elsewhere. Yet the Mormons failed to produce painters. There are 2 or 3 in Utah of regional fame, but that's it. And the Mormons were always much bigger organization in terms of number of members in Theosophical Society. And it's not that they didn't try. But Theosophical Society for a comparatively small dimension, a huge number of artists. I would argue that there are more famous modern artists who were Theosophists than were Catholic. And so that's interesting. And that's, I believe, the really valuable question. Why exactly so many artists were attracted to the Theosophical Society?
Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned about World Mother and Ruth Elizabeth Roberts. So in this context, it reminds me that Rukmini Arundel was also at a time being held as World Mother, and around late 1920s when the World Teacher Project was coming to an end. So did you find any painting where Arundel was portrayed as World Mother?
No, but if you find that, of course, will be also interesting. The problem is, and I know because when we did the Enchanted Modernities project, some of the people involved, Marco Pasi, Sarah Turner, went to a jar, but they were not shown any portraits of the masters because it's for the esoterical section. So one of the questions is, nobody knows, even if it's Brendan French, who was, I believe, at one stage a member of the esoterical section, legally or illegally took amateur photographs in a jar 20 years ago. And they are in his dissertation, which I had a lot of trouble in having, because since he believes he can be sued by the Theosophical Society for reproducing illegally the paintings, it's one of the very few dissertations who are in the National Library in Australia, but you cannot photocopy it. You can read, but not photocopy. So I had a lot of trouble in taking myself pictures from Brendan French's dissertation, and you have seen some of them. But apart from Brendan French's adventure, nobody that I know of really knows what is in the esoteric section in a jar. Some of these paintings may simply have disappeared, or the miniatures, history, we all know, archives, history, and things tend to disappear, but sometimes they also tend to reappear. So we don't know. Some of this stuff may be lost, but some of this stuff may still be in a jar.
Any others? Yes?
Well, I'd like to ask Massimo what he thinks is the reason so many artists joined the Theosophical Society. We'll still buy the book when it
I believe it's because they find... no, first I should say what I do not believe. I do not believe it's because of thought forms. That's a theory, I believe. Many people are still... There was an exhibition in Torino recently, in my own town, insisting on thought forms. I believe that's not the case, because, for instance, Mondrian explicitly wrote he didn't care for thought forms. But I believe it's because of Blavatsky, not because of thought forms, because they find some ideas on pure forms there that resonate with the whole modernist project in the arts. And, but why they go to Blavatsky in the first place is because, as now we know from modern historiography of art, modern art is not an atheistic project or a materialist or a Marxist project. It's a spiritualist but rarely Christian project. So these people were disillusioned with organized religion but still interested in spirituality. So they started looking around. Of course, they looked at the Rosicrucian, they looked at spiritualism. More than one looked at Christian Science. But most of them look at Blavatsky, because in Blavatsky they believe they found this Platonic way, you were talking about philosophy, of looking at a world of pure form, which is very germane to the modernist and even the abstract, of course, artistic project.
I think we have 1 minute left. Is there any final question for Massimo? Yes, please,
I was
Chairman.
wondering whether Hilmar Rathjen, Georgiana Houghton, Fuller, were they all the same kind of crazy? Is that a clue in a way, you know? Is there any link between their mental state and
I don't know, and I honestly, I even doubt whether Fuller was really crazy, but she was regarded as crazy because here we are, this very brilliant young woman hailed as a biggest deal in Australian art. Then she starts following Leadbeater and comes back saying, you know, I have seen Buddha, I have seen the master. So they basically took her to psychiatric hospital. So, but I don't know if she was really crazy, or as art historian John Kerr will have it, it was like a sort of anti-esoteric, anti-feminist prejudice led her to psychiatric hospital. But it's a very sad story anyway.
Not crazy, but embarrassing.
And also Leadbeater was embarrassing for reasons we know.
Thank you very much, Massimo.